Hello, I'm Graham Stevens, and my family has lived in the community of Langham in Pembrokeshire for several centuries. With the support of Heritage Lottery and other trusts and foundations, we've spent a year renovating our lovely medieval church, and at the same time, this community has undertaken the most extensive investigation so far into early 12th century Flemish settlement of South Pembrokeshire. It's been believed for many years that this village was one of a number in South Pembrokeshire that was settled in and built by people of Flanders. But could that belief possibly be derived from old Pembrokeshire legends? In spite of the lack of written records, our task has been to find out who these people were. We wanted to know about their culture, how they lived their lives, and most important, what effect they had on the South Pembrokeshire area and this community over the last 900 years. It's been an enormous challenge. So was it truth or was it legend? That's what we wanted to discover.
I'm Anna Weaver, and I led the in-depth historical and document research, scouring through records held all over the UK to help the history team piece this story together.
And I'm Jackie Wordsworth, and it was my task to coordinate the making of this tapestry, an activity which brought together a lot of people in the community to make it.
Hang on. Someone's missing. Where's Liz Rawlings? She's never here when you want her, is she?
Don't know.
Hang on. Hi, Liz. Where are you?
Inverness.
What are you doing there?
Oh, don't ask.
Anyway, tell everyone about your part in this huge project.
Me? Well, I was responsible for two aspects of the community project. The first was DNA, where we had 7 volunteers from the community who were testing to see whether or not they could trace their ancestry back to the Flemish. And the second one was the archaeology, both in the church and up at Great Nash. And here, again, we want to discover whether or not there was any Flemish trace round the village.
Thanks, Liz. We'll see you when you get back. So let's turn the clock back 12 months and see what we were able to discover about what happened here nearly a millennium ago. Let's go. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's play the music.
There are many communities in South Pembrokeshire that can lay claim to having been settled by the Flemish 900 years ago. But Langham appears to be the only community that is singled out by historians as having definitive Flemish origins, so that is where Graham is starting his quest.
It was back in 1586 that one William Camden referred to South Pembrokeshire as Little England beyond Wales. Perhaps it should have been Little Flanders beyond Wales. I'm going to meet someone who might be able to shed some more light on this. Hugh John.
Hello, Graham. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
Good. Come and sit down with us.
So I understand you've discovered a little bit more about our Flemish roots.
Well, Graham, we've got this book, an article that was written by the Reverend William Calladine. Reverend William was a minister here around about 1865. Right. He was probably in Langham for a couple of years, and as far as we know, this is the most recent article that was written about the story of the Flemish influence on Langham and the south of the county of Pembrokeshire. He talks about the people were descended from Flemings sent here in the reign of Henry I. He's very strong that this was the influence that they had. And he talked about the division between the English-speaking people in Langham and the south of Pembrokeshire and the Welsh-speaking people in other parts of Pembrokeshire. He says this to them: those people, though now for the most part on a level with their Welsh neighbours, have retained for them and their language a sort of hereditary contempt. For instance, they affect not to know the name of a single individual inhabiting that part of a canton or a parish in which Welsh is spoken.
Gosh, that's a strong word, isn't it? Strong terminology. Hereditary contempt.
Very strong, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you still see it in Pembrokeshire today, don't you? To the extent that you see English spoken in the south, you see Welsh spoken in the north, the schools, the language divide is there, English in the south, Welsh in the north. You see it there today. And he goes on to speak about the way, again, an influence of the Flems coming in. If you go to Flanders today, you'll find that a lot of the women, when they get married, will retain their maiden name. And this was something that happened in Langham. He writes, and to an extent today, you still get people referred to by their maiden name, even though they've got a married name.
Absolutely.
He writes this in probably around about 1865. Quaker alike, they intermarry with each other, so that they form a family of about 500 souls. But in many instances, the women keep their maiden name after marriage. The story's still there.
So I think we've established that the Flemings were here. Next question is, what brought them here?
That story goes back to before William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066. In fact, it goes back to 1051.
Right.
William met and fell in love with Princess Matilda, the only daughter of Count Baldwin of Flanders and granddaughter of King Robert of France, but there were barriers in the way of their marriage.
Unfortunately, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo IX, thought that they were too closely related. There were some sort of distant kinship ties, and he objected to the marriage, but it nevertheless went ahead. He may also have had some reservations about the growing power of William, who was becoming more secure in Normandy after defeating his enemies back in 1047.
William's marriage to Princess Matilda proved to be much more than a marriage of convenience.
It was a marriage in which I think there was a genuine amount of love between both parties. He gave her a coronation as befitting Queen of England on the 11th of May 1068. When he was abroad, she was his regent, and we know from various charters and documents that he trusted her implicitly. It was a very successful marriage. It produced a large number of children, and I think it was a very advantageous match for both.
Yes. But what is the marriage of a Norman duke to a Flemish princess, 30 years before the Normans came to Wales, got to do with Flemish settlement in South Pembrokeshire?
I'll get to that. Just be patient. Through his marriage to Princess Matilda, Flemish nobles and mercenaries provided by Count Baldwin joined William's invasion force in October 1066.
The invasion force that went to England under William's command in 1066 comprised a combination of different peoples. There were Normans, obviously, Norman aristocracy, who were hoping to make great wealth out of this. But there were others from northern France, from Boulogne, from Maine, and also from Brittany and Flanders.
I suppose the interesting thing about the army which William brings over is that he was lucky, first of all, that he could get it onto the ships, and that the wind was blowing the wrong way for Britain but the right way for him. Secondly, he was lucky that he was not facing the professional army which Harold had, because that, of course, was fighting the Battle of Stamford Bridge and won. But, of course, when you look at the army, it's clearly a lot of younger sons who are not likely to inherit, and therefore they see this as adventure, as gaining lands, marriages, women, and a place in society, a superior place.
The story of William's invasion and conquest of England is well known, but the events leading up to the Norman invasion of Wales less so. William's first task was to consolidate his grip on England. That wasn't proving so easy, so to avoid having to fight on two fronts, he chose not to invade Wales.
There was the creation, of course, of the martial lordships, which allowed the English crown to exercise vicarious control of that borderland between England and Wales by effectively giving very substantial powers to Roger Montgomery in Shrewsbury, William Fitzosbert in Hereford, and the wonderful Hugh of Avranches, Hugh the Fat, who was another one of the martial lords. So I think William was happy to exercise indirect control through those.
William the Conqueror died in 1087. However, throughout his life he'd remained devoted to his Queen Matilda.
I suppose the relationship between William the Conqueror and his queen is remarkable. Clearly, from the background from which she came, I suspect that she was in charge, that perhaps she shaped his career. He was very good at what he did, but clearly relied on her counsel and advice, because after all, he did leave her in charge of Normandy, which is not what you'd expect, really. But if you look at many of the Norman women, the ladies, the queens and princesses, they were very strong characters indeed, and were quite capable of running countries and, better than their husbands in some cases.
William the Conqueror was succeeded by his son, William Rufus. However, this William was not the forceful leader his father was.
William Rufus, the second son of William the Conqueror, succeeded to the throne of England. The elder brother Robert kept Normandy as the sort of paternal inheritance. And William Rufus had successes in Normandy in military campaigns, but he also faced challenges. He also made 2 campaigns against the Welsh, neither of which was very successful.
William Rufus died after a hunting accident on the 2nd of August, 1100.
Yeah? Accident?
Put it like this. The history books say it was an accident, but the events that followed his death suggest something different, because just 2 days later, his younger brother Henry had himself crowned king at Westminster Abbey. This didn't please some of the Norman nobility, who believed that his elder brother, Robert Curthose, the Duke of Normandy, who'd returned from the First Crusade, was the rightful heir.
In 1102, there was a major rising in England led by the Boleyn family, who are a very powerful Norman family who held extensive lands in England as well. And in particular, Robert of Boleyn was Earl of Shrewsbury. Henry felt that they were unreliable and dangerous and needed to be crushed, I think. Robert's younger brother Arnulf had been in Pembroke as Marcher Lord there under the crown, but he was trying to cut an independent course as well, and he's deprived of the lands in Pembroke, and these are taken over by Henry directly. And Pembroke Castle becomes an important centre of royal power, sort of direct royal control under Henry I.
The interesting thing about this, of course, is the role of the Flemish mercenaries again. The Count of Flanders, Robert II, provided Henry with a substantial body of Flemish mercenaries.
Rather than go home to Flanders after it was over, it appears that some hung around for the next scrap from which they might benefit financially. And there's a report of Flemish brigands raiding the monastery in Peterborough and stealing all their gold and silver. Henry needed to take action. The Anglo-Norman historian, William of Malmesbury, wrote of Henry's action in his History of the Kings of England in 1125.
The Welsh were in constant revolt, and King Henry maintained pressure on them by frequent expeditions until they surrendered. Also, in reliance on an admirable plan for reducing their ebullience, he removed into Wales all the Flemings who were living in England. Many Flemings who had trooped over in his father's time, relying on their kinship with his mother, were lying low in England in such numbers as actually to seem a burden on the realm itself. And so he collected them all together, as though into some great midden in the Welsh province of Ross, with all their goods and chattels, thereby simultaneously purging his kingdom and putting a brake on his headstrong and barbarous enemies.
William of Malmesbury implies that these Flemings who were sent were somehow the remnants of the ones who'd come over in 1066, or whether that's true or not is perhaps open to question.
But another chronicle, the Brita Tywysogion, the Welsh Chronicle of the Princes puts a different slant on the story.
A year after that, a folk of strange origin and customs, with nothing known of where they had been concealed in the island for many years before that, were sent by King Henry to Dyfed. They occupied the whole cantref called Rhos, near the estuary of the river called Cleddau, and drove away all the inhabitants from the land. And that folk had come from Flanders, the land that lies near the Sea of Britain, because the sea had overwhelmed the land and its bounds, and had thrown sand all over the ground, so that the whole land was unfruitful. And at last, since there was no place for them to live either on the coast because of the sea, or in the hinterland because of the great numbers of people living in it, and because they could not remain all together, therefore that folk came to beg King Henry a place wherein to live and to dwell. And he sent them to Rhos. And there they still remain, the inhabitants having lost their land.
Well, the Welsh Chronicles, known as Brit y Tywysogion, is important because it gives us a date for the arrival of the Flemings in Pembrokeshire, which it places in the year 1108. However, there are a number of interesting points about the account. It starts by saying that these Flemings had been hidden away for a long time in Britain, that they were already there. But then it goes on to suggest that they'd come straight over from Flanders following flooding and inundation of the land. So there are sort of inconsistencies in the account itself, and we can only guess why that's so. But what is clear is that the Welsh chronicler thought that the Flemings came in and that they drove out the Welsh from the cantref of Rhos. So this was really a major displacement of population by the Flemings, and it gives a sort of rather sharper edge to the story than you get from William of Malmesbury, though it's perfectly consistent with him, who said that Henry would use the Flemings to subdue the Welsh, subjugate the Welsh. And certainly the Welsh source itself is very much in line with that in its reference to driving the Welsh out from that part of Pembrokeshire.
The Normans and Flemings secured their grip on South Pembrokeshire by creating a border with a string of castles and earthwork forts in order to keep the Welsh to the north of the county, thus creating a safer haven for the settlers in the south. This barrier was known as the Lanska line, but constant, often successful incursions from the Welsh in the north meant that they had to keep on their toes. The village of Langham, 10 miles south of the Lanska, lies at the eastern edge of the Hundred of Rhos and on the Cleddau estuary. This was one of the many Pembrokeshire communities established by those early Flemish settlers. But what has made life difficult for the research team is that this particular village has never appeared on paper to have a definitive name. Over the centuries, that name has changed. Anna Weaver leads the document research team, and she's meeting historian and retired archivist Nicky Bosworth, who can tell her more.
There's always been the trouble in the past with people's names and place names because spelling wasn't standardised and really until after the 1870 Education Act, and people would write down how they heard words, and it would depend on the accent of the person saying the word and the understanding of the person listening. So there are lots of different forms of the spelling of Langham, but they almost sound the same. At one stage, a lot of the place names in Pembrokeshire, they put a DE in the middle, like Llandegum it would have become. So you've always got to keep a very open mind over the way that a place name has been spelt.
Graham is visiting Haverfordwest Castle. There's another factor relating to names that worries him.
It certainly does. The fact remains, though, that 900 years after the Flemings supposedly came to Pembrokeshire, there's very little tangible evidence of them here today. We have names in the dialect, things that are dropping out of the language. Droppel, for a doorstep, comes from dorpel, the Flemish word. We have things like a Flemish shovel or a Flemish hoe, even the corgi. We even have the Flemish chimney. What do you think, Simon?
Well, the Flemish chimney is a really interesting term, but in fact it's a misnomer, because actually they're certainly chimneys, but they are not Flemish.
So the Flemings clearly claim from Flanders. But what do we know about Flanders?
The county of Flanders was effectively created in 862 by Baldwin I. It was economically advanced, it was trading with the Baltics, it was trading with the British Isles, England especially, and also with Italy. And one thinks of the wool trade, which is demonstrated in the richness of things like the cloth halls. There was wine and also corn. It was very advanced. It had its own currency, the silver denier. So it was a very advanced part of medieval Europe.
So the Flemings came to Pembrokeshire, created communities here, settled, and presumably brought their culture. Where were those communities in Pembrokeshire?
Well, in fact, Graham, we are in the epicentre of the most important of them. This is the castle at Haverfordwest. One of the early leaders was Tancred, and it's significant that outside Haverfordwest there is a small settlement called Tancredston, but Tancred established Haverford in the early 12th century as the capital of the colony of the Flemings. So this was the centre. But we know that they established another number of communities. For example, we've got Letterston on the way to Fishguard, which was named after Leotard, the Little King. We've got Usmaston, which is just downriver. And then, of course, we've got Wiseau, Flandrensis, established Whiston. And there's lots of other place names in Pembrokeshire which are very indicative of a Flemish ancestry. For example, one thinks of Walwyn's Castle, Walwyn. There was Herbranston, Herbryn, and other places like Castle Flemish in South Pembrokeshire and Flemington. So, although the Flemings are tantalising in terms of, well, where is their legacy? The legacy is in the dialect of South Pembrokeshire, it's in the place names of South Pembrokeshire, and also, of course, the half dozen documents which have survived in the people like William of Malmesbury and the medieval chroniclers.
So we're beginning to build a picture of an advanced group of people who've come over from the Low Countries of Europe, brought with them an advanced culture, skilled in many areas, and settled in the county, and had quite a profound influence on the development of this part of the world.
Now that the work on the church is finally underway, the community volunteers have just 10 months to complete their research into the early Flemish settlement of South Pembrokeshire. They also need to conduct archaeological excavations at the site of the medieval manor house, undertake the DNA tests among some of the male members of the community, and, most importantly, create a tapestry which can communicate with smartphones and tablets. This is planned to be a marriage of medieval storytelling and 21st century technology. But before they can start the stitching, the community need the designs. Fran Evans, a children's illustrator, is tasked with that job.
We went up to the local school to ask the children to help with the designs. We initially read the 6 stories that the 6 designs are going to be based on to the children, and they came up with very individual designs for each story. So the process now is I'm working half scale at the moment because the pieces are much bigger than this. I'm picking out pieces from each drawing, really, trying to include as many of the children's work as I can, to be fair, but also, picking the best stuff as well. And composing an image per story. At the moment, I'm working on the second image, which is a view of Godbert the Fleming arriving in Langham with his two sons, Richard and Rodbert. So we ask the children to think about everything they would see as they're sort of coming down the river into Langham with all their possessions that they wanted to bring with them. So some of them have put horses and dogs and their birds of prey that they would have gone hunting with. And then they've gone further really into sort of illustrating the river as well, which is fantastic. And also they've put in little images of any settlement that would have been in Langham at that time. And somebody's put a welcome sign there, which is fantastic. But all these little details are brilliant with, children's drawings are amazing to work with because they include images that grown-ups just wouldn't do.
Attention now turns to a farm believed to be the site of a medieval manor house built by the De la Roche family. The research team have already discovered that the family were descended from one Godbertus Flandrensis de Ros, who was born in Pembroke Castle in 1096. They hope to find evidence that this site was occupied as early as that, but records only show an occupation from 1244 onwards, so a 19-day excavation is planned.
Right, we're just starting to do our gradiometer survey of the walled garden. We've gridded it out, we put down our lines so that we know exactly where to walk, and we're just training up the first group of people to do the survey itself, which involves walking up and down very systematically, up and down a 20-metre grid that goes across the walled garden. It's taking readings about every 25 centimetres. It's doing all these differences in the magnetic susceptibility, really, of the ground below. So things like ditches and pits might show up. Hearths show up very well. Metal objects show up far too well, unfortunately. So that's where we are.
18, 19, 20, 2 beeps.
Anna is meeting Dr. Jessica Lutkin, a medieval historian who has some interesting documents to show her.
This document that I have to show you is one of the oldest public records we have. It's second only to the Domesday Book.
Wow.
So this is an extract from what we call a pipe roll.
So what was a pipe roll?
Right, the pipe roll was a record of all the money that came from the counties, from the land that was owned by the king. Everyone had to pay a certain amount of money to hold the land. It was collected by the sheriffs of the county, and the record was then taken for each county and recorded in this roll. Okay, so we have an entry on this particular rotulet that is related to Langham. You probably recognise this name. You can see Godbert there. It's so beautifully written. You couldn't imagine that this is nearly a millennia ago.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
And I have here you are as a little translation for you. There you are.
All right. Godbertus Flandrensis, Godbert the Fleming of Ross, renders account of 12 silver marks for the land which Lambertus Ecinus holds in the treasury for silver marks.
So it was actually quite a substantial amount of money that was passing out, especially for the 12th century.
So potentially he was somebody who was willing to take a chance to do whatever he could to make some money, and in that way he bought himself into a good lifestyle and was able to get this land around Langham.
This is an absolutely extraordinary record that we have of him. It's such an early survival. It's very exciting.
Liz is taking a long-awaited phone call.
Okay, thank you. So that's it. The DNA tests are here, and our volunteers are waiting to spit into the tubes. They are all men from the locality, and they can all track their ancestry back to the mid-1700s. So we have an unbroken male line. When they've completed their tests today, they'll all be sent off to be analysed, and hopefully one of them, or perhaps more, will have Flemish ancestry.
My family left here in 1930-ish, as far as I know. I'm the first one to return to Pembrokeshire, but they all lived in Dumpledale, which is just over from the back of my house, the other side of the valley. And I've managed to trace the family right back to mid-1700s. But somebody in the village has got hold of it as well and has tracked it back to the mid-1600s. I would hope that this DNA will show that it does go right back to the days when the village was formed by the immigrant Flemings that came here at the time. There's the potential there for Fleming ancestry, but we'll have to wait and see.
We always thought there was a Flemish influence in the family. I don't know where that came from, sort of folklore and sort of family talks over the years, and I really wanted to go for the DNA testing just to confirm or not confirm. If that happened, that would be disappointing, but it would be really good if we could find more out about our family and where we came from.
The samples of saliva given by the volunteers have now gone off for analysis. It will be several months before they know the results. The team have found it very difficult to discover exactly who Godebert the Fleming was. Early records show him as being born in Pembroke around 1096, but not who his parents were, suggesting that he was not of noble birth. He was also born 10 years before Henry I sent the Flemings to Pembrokeshire, so who was he?
Godebert is a fascinating individual, and unfortunately we know so little about him. We don't even know the names of his parents. Possibly we can conjecture that he was the son of a well-to-do Flemish mercenary captain. We don't know, an officer, but all that is known is that he was a man of property. By 1130 he is a person buying land. And of course he was the man after whom was the De la Roche family, which has such importance in Pembrokeshire. But he was certainly a remarkable individual who established his own dynasty of sorts in the 12th century.
Anna meets members of the document research team. She has some interesting news.
I've had some difficulty finding documents going back as far as the 12th century. The main thing I found that has been really helpful has been the pipe roll from 1130. But it's quite interesting when you look at the areas of land that the family had. Langham is set quite far back, really. The rest of the properties are all along the Landsker line. Right. Mm-hmm. So Newgale, Roach, Trefgarn, Knowlton. Langham doesn't seem entirely to fit in with that. A little bit further back from the front. Yes. Yes.
And maybe a refuge.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Oh, right, interesting.
And obviously they would have been worshipping in Langham at the time, although it wouldn't be the church that we know today, as that was built quite a lot later, 1185.
Right, so there was a church already there in some shape or form.
The original Celtic church.
Yes.
With Fran's designs now complete, Jackie Wordsworth has to organise the stitching teams.
I've got the 6 designs from Fran, obviously using the children's drawings, which will now be copied so that we can all have our own copy. And she will then colour up smaller ones so that we can match the colours on the colour chart for the crewel wool. Each of these will have to go through a process called pricking and pouncing so that we can actually transfer the design onto the fabric and the backing fabric ready to stitch. Patrick is building 6 frames, 1 for each of the panels. They're bigger than a normal tapestry frame, so each one will hold the size of the panel.
Graham has made a discovery that could have an enormous effect on the research.
Well, that's really interesting. This is an account by Anselmus of Gembloux, written in 1134, which puts the storm surge in 1134. Now that's at variance with the Brita Tusogion, who puts it at 1105. That's nearly 30 years difference. I wonder, could that mean that there were 2 migrations? That's something that we're going to have to look at in more detail.
The Chronicle of the Princes, I Bruti
Tywysogion tells us of the arrival of the Flemings as a result of a catastrophic flood of the Low Countries in the early 12th century. Now, it could be that that's referring to a different wave of Flemish migration to that which William of Malmesbury talks about. We don't know how many came. One estimate has put it as about 2,500. In that case, there would have been a very significant and a very sizable minority living in Pembrokeshire.
There's something that's aroused Anna's curiosity too.
We found a fair bit about the family of Godbert the Fleming. We've sorted out the earlier part of the family tree. We know that he had 2 sons, Richard and Rodbert, and we've also discovered an interesting piece of writing, the Song of Dermot and the Earl. Dermot MacMurdo was the King of Leinster, and his kingdom had been taken over by the High King of Ireland. Dermot had appealed to King Henry II in 1167 for military help to get his kingdom back from the High King. Henry realised that an English mounted military exercise in Ireland would be potentially toxic, but he agreed that Dermot could approach the knights in southwest Wales, and Richard, Godbert the Fleming's eldest son, was really keen to go and help. In the Norman French poem, The Song of Dermot and the Earl, there's a reference to Richard Fitzgodbert going on an excursion to Ireland in 1167.
Mais Dermot, li gentireis, od segereis gent anglais, ne menada à Isel tour, selon le 10 de mon contour. Ne, mais un Ricard, comme l'on dire, un chevalet de Pembrokeshire. Le fils Godobert Ricard, chevalet hier de Bompard, chevalet, archer et sergent, mais je ne sais dès que et quand. Car ne jouerons longuement en Irlande et le gens, car ens ne peut profiter faire, al rey guéresse en la terre. Pour ce que peut errant de gens, que passe astivement.
No one knows why Richard Fitzgodbert chose to go to Ireland in 1167 rather than wait until 1169 when Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, had built up his invasion force. But there is one small clue in Gerald of Wales's A Journey Through Wales, written in 1185. Gerald was born at Manorbier Castle in 1146. He was the 4th son of Sir William de Barry and he became a clergyman. As a young man, he lived among the Flemish settlers and he knew them well. This is what he wrote about them.
The inhabitants of this province derived their origin from Flanders and were sent by King Henry I to inhabit these districts. A people brave and robust, ever most hostile to the Welsh. A people, I say, well versed in commerce and woolen manufactories. A people anxious to seek gain by sea or land, in defiance of fatigue and danger. A hardy race, equally fitted for the plough or the sword. A people brave and happy.
A people anxious to seek gain by sea or land in defiance of fatigue and danger. Is it possible that Gerald was thinking of Richard Fitzgodbert when he wrote that?
There's a mystery that needs to be solved. The identity of the 2 effigies, one a knight and the other a lady, both lying in the North Transept. Graham is meeting Rhiannodd Bibrach, a medieval historian and an expert on medieval church architecture, to find out more.
What can you tell us about this?
Well, just from looking at the effigy, all you can really tell about identity is when the person would have died, because this effigy is produced in about the 1340s, and we can date it quite securely to that period because of the armour and the costume that he's wearing. Some bits are really quite distinctive. So, for example, the fact that his coat armour is quite short and cut off at the knee. Now, any earlier than this, and you would expect it to be longer. Any later, you'd expect this bottom kind of skirt effect to be a bit more tight-fitting and shorter. You've got to look at the way in which he's lying, and in particular the crossed legs. Now, crossed legs are a feature of military effigies that were produced between about 1250 and about 1350. So we can be fairly certain then, because of his crossed legs, that this wasn't produced any later than about 1350.
Right. So the second effigy that we've got here of the lady, we think predates the one of the knight. So what can you tell us about this one?
Well, she certainly does predate him by several decades at least. There are all sorts of telltale signs, again, that would situate her, I would not say much later than about 1300. Her costume, which, although difficult to date precisely, is clearly not of the style of the 14th century. And, you know, if this had been made in about anything later than 1320, you would have been able to tell by the headdress and by the style of the gown that she's wearing. Later on in the 1340s, when we're assuming Robert de la Roche dies and there's this family crisis, the other members of the family, his executors, his widow possibly, decide that they want to make a grand statement. And so they have this double tomb erected with this elaborate cusped and crocketed and pinnacled canopy to draw attention to it. The huge heraldic display underneath. They put Robert, possibly, in one niche, and they bring his grandmother, maybe, to sit in the niche alongside him, again to emphasise the continuity of lineage of the family. So by having her associated with this newer effigy, you are underlining the fact that this family has been here for generations, it is their land, and it will continue to be their land in the future.
The tapestry stitching has started, and master weaver and embroiderer, the Reverend Andrew Johnson, guides Liz Beresford and Barbara Alderman through their first stitches.
I think that one's a bit big.
Do they just pull out?
If you look for the loop, this got a loop on it.
Oh, I see, it's on from there. Right.
If you pull from the loop, it should.
God, I haven't concentrated on anything like this for a long time.
Down there.
Yep.
And I pull.
But before you push the needle any further,
Pull that.
draw your chain stitch up onto it.
Right.
Yep. Now it can go down through. Make sure you put your finger onto that before you go any further.
They are facing a huge job with learning to embroider for the first time, for most of them, on big frames. Working on a big project where all the panels have got to be coordinated together, and learning new stitches and new ways of working them that are different from most probably the ways they learnt when they were children.
Like. Oh, that's better.
Don't ever suck threads.
No? Oh.
No. Threading a needle. You fold the thread over the needle. Mm-hmm. You pinch it between your fingers so you can't see it. If you pinch it tight enough, it will go through the eye.
Okay.
That's why we choose these large-eyed needles.
Right, okay, I'm just going to have a quick sloop.
The dig at the farm has been progressing well, and the archaeologists have made some interesting discoveries.
Just looking through a number of the finds we've got, a number of these have now been washed as well. Still looking at some lovely pieces of medieval pottery, rim sherds of jars, cooking jars, a lot of pieces of jugs as well, very typical medieval kind of pottery. And a few bits that are, they don't look like much, just very basic pottery, ceramic, terracotta on the outside. But as we see on a number of the sherds, there's a lot of sooting on them, so they were definitely cooking pots. They've definitely been in a fire, because we've still got some of those remnants of the burning.
The tapestry team are having an open day, so the community can see how their work is progressing.
Hi, Jackie. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. All 6 frames are here.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Have you seen how big?
Lots of people.
Yeah. They're coming on brilliant.
And everybody wants advice.
Well, absolutely. I've been
And
trying to
colours
get round.
and rolling out.
Some of them aren't ready to roll out yet, but
Pull it through.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with the whole thing's coming together. Most people have got their head round the stitching that we're doing. The panels are colouring up very quickly, which has been quite a scary thing as far as we've been concerned. The groups that are working around each frame have seemed to gel and are getting very excited about the bit of work that they're doing. And so, I'm really pleased with the way the whole thing's coming together.
Graham seems to be drawing a blank with his research.
Well, there's a lot of literature here about the invasion and the Norman conquest, but so little about the Flemish and the part that they played. What we really need to find out is how they fitted into the social structure of South Pembrokeshire. But this has drawn a blank. I don't know. Let's see what we can find.
As so often in the Middle Ages, we know a lot more about the elites of society in South Pembrokeshire at this time, and we can see a hierarchy at the sort of upper end of society. Gerald of Wales's family at Manorbier, the de Barrys, are a good example of this. There were also burgesses in towns like Haverfordwest, and indeed some of what we'd call villages, it's been argued, were really rural boroughs. There were special privileges given to the settlers there in terms of being freed from various renders, being given advantageous terms of landholding. So they were sort of quite wealthy peasants, if you like. But in general in Pembrokeshire, there must have been people of Welsh descent, but alongside people of Anglo-Saxon descent, and then this elite of Norman and Flemish descent at the top.
All I can say is that most of the records that have survived are almost exclusively dealing with taxation, exchequer returns, property transactions, but we do get the names of people, and it's a remarkably rich mix of cosmopolitan names, Welsh names, English names, Norse, Flemish, and so it's a cosmopolitan community. How the dynamics worked was, one would imagine that the sort of Norman barons with their Flemish mercenaries, they would have obviously controlled the levers of power, but how it actually worked further down is very difficult to describe because of the paucity of records.
And what of their language and culture?
We know that Flemish was still being spoken around 1200 because Gerald of Wales refers to one of his brothers speaking to one of the sort of Flemish notables in Flemish at about that time. According to the chronicler in Chester, Ranulph Higden, Flemish had died out by the time he was writing in around 1340 or so. But more generally, it does seem the Flemings were very clearly identifiable group, certainly into the early 13th century, and Gerald of Wales is a very important source for this. He sees them as a distinct people, but also that they had distinct customs, in particular the idea that you could predict the future by boiling shoulder blades of rams and looking at the bones that emerged. And this was seen as a distinctive Flemish custom. And it may be that that the Flemish language survived in certain contexts. It doesn't mean that they couldn't also speak English or any other language for communication with others, their neighbours. But English and Flemish at this time were quite closely related as well, so it would have been possible to be, in a sense, bilingual. As you say, have in Scandinavia now, you can speak your own language and to someone from a different country and they can speak theirs and you're mutually comprehensible. That might have helped, I suppose, to keep Flemish going as well.
So Gerald of Wales clearly saw them as a separate group, and the languages, English and Flemish, were akin to one another. And yet, we still don't have the information that we need. You know, I think it's probably best if we go somewhere where we can find this information, where maybe they do have these records. And that takes us to Flanders itself. Anyway, I quite fancy a Belgian beer.
But before he can cross the channel, Graham is joining other DNA volunteers at a special event at Pembroke Castle. Their DNA sampling was carried out in association with a TV series looking at DNA makeup of the whole of Wales. The results are coming through on a video link.
Information. It looks to be a Welsh ancestry.
However, for these men, the results demonstrate that while some have strong genetic links to the continent, none have a definitive connection to Flanders.
I wasn't surprised, really. I didn't think that it would have been nice to have another branch of the family somewhere else, but at the end of the day, I'm Welsh and very proud of being Welsh.
According to this, there's such a huge spread, they can't pin me down to any particular race or creed, so I'm classing myself as Heinz 57 varieties. It's an amazing result, but when you consider I've tracked my father's family back to 1640 in Langham, I was hoping or thought there may have been some definite roots, but apparently no, from all over the place.
There was one volunteer who was unable to get to Pembroke Castle. He is Norman Roach, and Graham has brought his results to show him. This time, they proved to be quite a revelation.
I think we've got something very, very interesting to show you today.
Now, you belong to a very unusual type. You belong to a group that's sometimes known as V12, and there's only one place in the world where it's common, and that's in northeast Africa, specifically in southern Egypt. It looks as if it crossed the Mediterranean by a seaborne spread, and this is how this type has reached Europe. And this was probably a single individual who moved at some point in the last couple of thousand years. I believe that you were interested in whether your Y chromosome matched that of the Roche family. And we've been able to find data about the Y chromosomes of a number of men called Roche, principally of Irish descent. And a large number of these men actually all match one another. And when we look to compare your chromosome to their chromosome, they match. So this shows that the Roche family in Pembrokeshire match the Roche family in Ireland, and that you descend from these people. You all carry this incredibly rare haplotype that appears deep in the past to have come from what's now Egypt.
So what do you make of that then?
Well, incredible. Although my father always said that there was a link to Ireland, he didn't have any proof or anything, but somewhere along the family line, it must have been handed down. No, it's incredible.
So again, potentially, you can trace your ancestry right the way back to the De La Roche family. So the Roche bit, the Roche family, links you right the way back to the original settlers of Langham. How does that make you feel?
It makes you feel humble in a way, really, you know. Compared to the other DNAs, it's so unique.
Well, those were really fantastic results. I can't believe it. The next thing now is when we go to Belgium, what will be really exciting is if our results have a match in Belgium. And I'm just off now to see James Meek in Llandilo, our archaeologist, and hopefully he will have some incredible information for us as well. So, James, have you got anything exciting to tell me?
Oh, we've now got the dates back for the pottery. The best thing about the dating is the majority of the pot we got is definitely medieval. You know, of all those good bits, they're all in the sort of high medieval period, so 13th, 14th century. But we have had a number of sherds that actually go back into the 12th. In fact, one of them I think is meant to be early 12th century. Wow. And if we start going back to that period, we're obviously pre when we think Great Nash was established. So it would imply that there's, I mean, certainly we're not in the middle of Langham. You know, we know Langham was established before that period. But Great Nash House itself, to actually have that pottery coming out from the site that's of the, you know, early 1100s, I mean, that's really good news.
That means that there was somebody on that site, there was a habitation there, before the date that we found, which is 1244 with Sir David of Llandegynni.
There was an awful lot on site because we only dug a couple of small trenches, but we have 2 large boxful of the material. There was a lot of it, it's a lot of cooking pots. Yes, it's disposable, but it does imply, especially as it's only with one house, it does imply a big kitchen. There's quite a lot going on, a lot of cooking and a lot of breaking.
Yeah.
Peter Holden, the architect, has been called to the church. Having removed the render, the contractor has found that the stone wall at the far end of the near 700-year-old family chapel is standing on mud.
And secondly, if it were to be damaged by frost or water, you could find stones dislodging and that affecting the wall above. It's pretty miraculous that it hasn't done that before. So what I'd like to do is to cast 4 inches of concrete with a chamfered top in there as a plinth.
The age of the chapel gives us a clue as to why the wall is in such a precarious state.
Given that it's been there for 1,000 years, it's not in that way. It's not clay.
The chapel was built in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death, which reached Britain in 1348 and killed up to 40% of the population. In isolated rural communities, the death rate was even higher, up to 66%. The state of the wall suggests that it was constructed not by stonemasons, who locally had probably all died in the Black Death, but by ordinary labourers with very few wall building skills.
So I think we got to win that.
Langham is featured in several old Pembrokeshire legends. In one, it is said that many years ago, the effigy of Margaret de la Roche, who died 40 years before the family chapel was built, was placed by the high altar, and that her bones lay beneath her effigy. After the de la Roche family chapel was built in 1349, her effigy was moved here to join her grandson, Sir Robert de la Roche. Neil Martin has brought a miniature camera to explore the spaces below the effigies to see if the legend remains true.
Well, certainly down in this hole that we're investigating at the moment, by the fact that we can see nothing on the endoscope, and every time I pull the endoscope back out, it's covered in this fine dust, which is rock dust. My guess is that there's nothing, certainly on that line down there, which we decided was the most likely place for there to be a coffin. There's no coffin within that distance, and there's not a sign of anything apart from dust and rubble. So I think that pretty much, as far as we can tell, kills the myth that one of the bodies might be underneath the effigies. Sadly.
Graham and Liz are heading to Flanders in northern Belgium. They want to learn about the Flanders of the Middle Ages, the continuing impact of flooding, but above all discover more about the lifestyles of the Flemish people who made South Pembrokeshire their home 900 years ago. Graham is meeting Professor Tim Soons, a medieval historian and an expert on the hydrography of the Flemish coastline. He wants to learn more about the flooding referred to in the Brít y Tywysogion.
Tim, we've established that the Brít y Tywysogion, the Chronicle of the Princes, probably got the date of the major flood wrong by about 30 years. We're now fairly confident it was 1134. What were the consequences of that flood in terms of both the changes to the landscape and the social changes brought about by people being displaced?
Well, this 1130, it's indeed, the flood occurred in probably October 1134, and it was one of these major floods. There are a few recorded major floods in the 11th and 12th century Flemish and Zeeland world. Probably caused a lot of damage, but it should not be seen as an isolated event. So it's part of a bigger process in which this whole coastal landscape has been reorganized gradually, in which floods and major floods are getting increasingly frequent and people are pushed out of the area. We have to imagine this whole early medieval coastal world as a society of freeholders, a society of free peasant communities, we would call them, enjoying what is sometimes called the liberty of the marsh. There we have these independent, political, juridical, independent communities of free people, who are very active not only in farming and fishing but only in trade, who are integrated to other parts of the North Sea world, to the Scandinavian world, northern Germany, the Frisian world, and to England, also this coastal world of England. Society of traders, merchants, and farmers also, but who are different, you could say, from the inland world of continental Europe by their freedom. Freedom is what distinguishes them. And then, about, well, the early 11th century, we see that the society is changing, that people are starting to build seawalls and dikes. And this enables a sort of more permanent flood protection. It also enables another type of land use. You can start arable farming, for instance. But as we know very well today, the more seawalls, the more flood protections you build, the more the risk of big floods increases.
Liz has come to see Mark van den Kloot. She's hoping that there are people in Flanders whose DNA matches that of the De la Roche family.
Well, you know a little bit about the project that we're carrying out, yes. And you know that we have Norman Roche, who has got quite a rare haplogroup.
Yes, indeed. The subhaplogroup Norman is belonging to is very rare indeed. It's only 1.9%. 0.9%. It's very small, actually. Well, 11 out of 1,200 participants.
So do you think those 11, they have the same subhaplogroup as Norman? Do you think that actually proves that Norman, his family, are Flemish?
In theory, yes, because they all belonging to that, all men belonging to that subhaplogroup have somewhere a common ancestor.
Graham has come to the University of Ghent. He's meeting literary historian Vele Utersprot, who has something interesting to show him.
We do have an author and a painter, an artist in the 16th century, a Fleming. Lucas de Heer was in his name, and he came from Ghent, and he was actually a refugee when he went to Britain, and he wrote a description of England, of Britain, a description of Britain with also a history of Britain, and he says that in Pembrokeshire, a colony of Flemish lived from the beginning of the 12th century. It was founded in 1106, I think, the Heer says. And he says, and the language has preserved. I've spoken some of those people. Their Flemish was quite good at the time, and we're speaking of the 16th century.
So that in total contrast to earlier writings.
With earlier and later writings, because there is one author, George Owen, writing in the 17th century, 30 years later than the Heer, and he says there is no sign of the language either. And so the Heer is really unique in that.
The discovery that a Flemish man wrote of hearing his mother tongue 400 years after the original Flemish settlement of Pembrokeshire has caught the team by surprise. They understood the language had died out long before that. Graham and Liz are visiting Musea Ravenside, just north of Ostend, where there's a reconstructed medieval fishing village.
Well, I'm off to see Dr. Monix Peters, who's the chief archaeologist on this project.
Well, and I'm off to cook a meal.
See you later.
Okay.
So now we're entering, in fact, the working place of the man in the village responsible for the smokehouse and the bakery.
Gosh. So as research director of the Flanders Heritage Agency, you were responsible for developing the whole site?
Yes, I had the opportunity to do the excavation. So in 1992 they looked for somebody who could, during several years, who could do the excavations here. And it was a collaborative project between the province of West Flanders and our heritage agency, and they gave me the time to excavate all the area necessary in function of the development of this area. So I had all the opportunity to do the excavations in ideal circumstances. We know through archaeological data that the village already probably existed in the 10th, 11th or 12th century. They in fact lived from fishing, but fishing is in fact an oversimplification of their activity. Besides fishing, they do piloting of merchant vessels, they do piracy if they can, they perform military service for the Duke. All the fishing villages, to give them, I think here in Raverset, they had to give 2 ships with completely armed and with the military people included.
So would that be the same when William of Normandy took his invasion force to Britain? Would the people of Flanders have gone with him with their ships? Would he have commanded or commandeered those ships?
That could be, because where do you find ships? William had to cross the channel, so he needed ships. It is fairly probable that they also looked for ships in fishing villages.
So the men were off fishing. What role did the women have in the village?
I think that's something which comes clearly from the archaeological evidence. This village is completely dominated by women. Women, they govern the entire village. Women also help during the harvest season for the farmers. So we find a lot of evidence that women also play an important part in the economy. They do also some additional bit for the income.
In our own village of Langham, the women sold the fish and travelled many miles to sell the fish. Is there any evidence of the baskets that were used to carry the fish? Because again, in Langham, we have women carrying what we call panniers, which are wicker baskets, large wicker baskets with leather straps over their shoulders.
Yeah, we have found a lot of wicker baskets in the archaeological record. Also the netting needles, which are probably, I think, made by women that mend the net or make the nets even. And which are nicely kept netting needles with a property mark on it and so on. So there is I strongly believe that women are dominating. Women, if you would have a look into the village, you would see walking around women and children.
I think it's probably time to go and see what the girls are doing, see if they've rustled up any food for us.
Okay, we'll do that.
What are we actually going to make here today?
Oh, today we are prepare some fish. We're in fishing village, so we make flatfish. So here you have flatfish. We're cooking them in a little bit water, and after we are making a sauce with nuts.
We have walnuts and almonds.
Almonds, yes.
Okay. This meal, the chicken, would be a meal for the nobility.
Everybody can eat chicken, but how you prepare it, it's more for older people or for nobility.
Okay.
In this case, we are making it with more fruits, and so it's more for nobility.
These would be expensive
for
ordinary people.
Amandels and this kind of fruit are, of course, expensive.
Okay.
So it's more for the nobility.
Just wafting a bit, smells
but there are a lot of
spices?
Spices inside. You have cannel, you have
cinnamon.
Yes, cinnamon.
Thank you so much.
Wait, why am I serving you?
Because you're a serving wench.
On the night of the 31st of January 1953, a powerful storm hit the North Sea. The following morning, the storm surge, combined with the spring tide, raised water levels to almost 6 metres above sea level and flooded hundreds of square miles of the coastal areas in England, Belgium and the Netherlands. More than 2,000 people were killed. Over 1,800 of them lived on the wetlands that run along the coasts of southern Holland and Belgium. This flood would have been like the Great Flooding of 1134, which according to the Brita Tywysogion brought Flemish refugees to Wales. Graham and Liz have crossed the border into southern Holland and are visiting the Watersnood Museum. Liz is meeting Leanne Koeman, the museum's curator, to find out more.
We started in 2001, but the process to this museum started a couple of years earlier, in 1993, with a national commemoration service. And people that survived the flood said, why isn't there a place where we can commemorate and remember what happened in 1953? Because we must never forget what happened. It was a flood that hit 3 provinces of the Netherlands, being Zeeland, the northern of Brabant and the south of Holland. And the devastation in that area was enormous because there was no television, no radio, no communication, and the flood struck the area in the middle of the night.
Obviously we're interested in the comparison between the flood of 1953 and the flood of 1134 and the impact of both.
The loss of possession, but also the loss of land and animals and everything that was struck by the water, and people being evacuated to different areas because their own land was flooded. So some of them also decided to leave the area that was flooded after 1953, so that has some connection with your story, I think.
It's amazing to think that it's just that narrow strip of elevated land, the dyke, that stands between this area and the Scheldt estuary, and indeed the whole of the North Sea. It's unimaginable what must have happened in 1134 when the storm surge came and that dyke, or whatever was there before, probably not even that, was totally overwhelmed. The people stood no chance at all. Well, I think that was amazingly successful, really, wasn't it? I mean, we talked to a number of experts who really came up with the goods.
What was the highlight for you, do you think?
I think probably Dr. Monix Peters, the archaeologist in the Riverside Museum, he came up with some amazing stuff which you could almost feel the relationship between the fishing communities in Flanders and the home in Langham, and how tough they were and how independent they were, and also, you know, that the women featured very strongly within their communities.
Yeah.
And then he went on, of course, to tell us about, you know, how tough the sailors were and that they were very warlike, and that they were part of William's army going across, and William actually was able to requisition ships. So the Flemish fishermen were the Flemish mercenaries that actually came across to Britain.
I think for me the highlight really was when I was talking with Mark about the Belgian DNA project, which is, you know, which we were hoping we would find living relatives, because Norman's DNA was so rare, because he's got a very rare haplogroup and sub-haplogroup. They actually found 11 living relatives in Belgium. I just thought, that is awesome.
I think it's more than we could have ever hoped for, to find a direct relationship between the Flemish settlers of Langham and right back to Belgium. That is way beyond our expectations at the beginning of this project.
After 10 months of intense activity, St Jerome's Church prepares itself to reopen for its 832nd year of service to the community. It now looks as though it might enjoy its millennium. Liz is keen to break the news to Norman about his links with Flanders.
So, you've had your DNA results. Were you surprised or pleased?
Shocked, a little shocked. Pleased, yes. I'm glad I went through with it.
Brilliant, because certainly your DNA is rare, E117, and obviously it's linked to the De La Roche family. Well, it's an exact match. Would you have thought that you could have found all this information just simply by doing a DNA sample?
No, to be honest, no.
No. It's just amazing, isn't it? We did this Belgian trip where we did a lot of research in Belgium. We met up with Mark van den Klooten, who's been running a project on behalf of the Belgian government, looking at the DNA of Flemish people.
Yeah.
And he's given me some information for you, which I think you might be surprised about, that you actually have 10 living relatives in Belgium and 1 in Holland.
Not guilty, I've never been there.
Honestly, your DNA is an absolute match. Isn't that fantastic?
With
10 living in Belgium and 1 in Holland.
It gets curiouser and curiouser.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've now sort of done a lot more research on the family tree. So this is where we're at the moment. I mean, obviously, there are other bits and pieces that add on the bottom.
Now, you had this dig at Nash, because De La Roche lived at Nash.
Yes.
So I'm related to the De La Roches who lived at Nash.
Yes. Yeah.
As Liz and Norman pore over his ancestors' family tree, Anna has called Graham and Jackie to come to the church. There was one final mystery for the team to unravel, that of Sir Roger de Clarendon, who married into the De La Roche family in 1376. She reckons she's found the answer.
What have you got?
No, let's see.
Do you remember I met up with Dr. Jessica Lutkin?
Yeah.
Well, she had a lot of interesting things to say about Sir Roger de Clarendon. He was the illegitimate son of the Black Prince, the grandson of Edward III, and the half-brother of Richard II. He was a bit of a lad by all accounts. He married Margaret de la Roche in 1376. She was the heiress to the de la Roche estates in Pembrokeshire. This is what she had to say.
What I have here for you is the Black Prince's will.
Right.
And here we are on this line. The item we give to Roger de Clarendon, knight, a silk bed. And a silk bed, it sounds to us today as quite weird. Why would you give somebody a bed? They were very, very expensive, very valuable items.
So it was a great thing to be left then, a silk bed.
Absolutely. Roger was quite a character. I think he was quite spoilt by his father and his grandfather, and he got away with quite a lot of things. He was quite... He almost went off the rails later on in his life. So after the death of his father and his grandfather, and then the death of his wife only a few years later, she died in 1382, and he didn't get her land because she hadn't come of age.
Right.
So his potential land that he could have held was technically taken away from him. It was also the time of the usurpation of Richard II. What Roger was a potential claimant to the throne. And then about 1402, the priories of England started to try and overthrow Henry IV. Their little revolts started happening in little pockets, and Roger came out of hiding and got involved in one of these little revolts.
Right.
Unfortunately for him, Henry IV decided to make an example of him and the priory, so the prior and a few household servants and Roger were all captured in London, and they were all executed as traitors, and so they were hung and beheaded.
Ooh, so he came to a sticky end, didn't he?
Certainly did.
Yeah, silk bed or not.
I think he chose the wrong side in the end.
Sure he did.
So, the story of Godbert the Fleming and his descendants was a real rags to riches story, wasn't it? Gosh, descended from a Flemish mercenary coming in with William the Conqueror, his descendants ended up marrying royalty.
They certainly did, and Godbert had some interesting 20th century descendants as well. President Lyndon Johnson, really? Sir Winston Churchill, and Princess Diana, to name just 3. It's an amazing story.
Isn't this where we came in?
I think you're right, you know. Well, haven't we discovered a lot?
Yes,
that's me.
Yes,
goodness, I mean,
absolutely.
You still here? Yeah. Better play us out then.